Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Angela Luton. I am a child protection specialist with KidCheck, and today we are doing Predator Proofing Your Organization Part 2. So if you joined me the first time, welcome back. If you're just joining me for the first time today, welcome. And I wanted to let you know a couple things before we get started. We do have Alyssa who's monitoring chat today. So if you have any questions that come up during our time, make sure that you put those in the chat. We're going to try to save all of the questions for Q&A at the end. This presentation is slated to take around 45 minutes and then 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. But if there's verification that's needed while I'm speaking, please go ahead and put that in the chat because Alyssa will make sure that I'm able to clarify any points that there might be some confusion on. Also, if you are attending today, you're going to be receiving an email after our presentation that includes both Part 1 and Part 2 links. So you will have those once again, so you'll get both things, because today really does build on what we learned in Part 1. So with that said, we've got a ton of information to share with you today, and it's going to be like drinking out of a fire hose. But remember, you're getting the slide deck, so that will be very helpful. And so let's go ahead and get started. I just want to reiterate that the goal of our time today is to really help your organization to build a proactive culture that prioritizes child protection and safety. And in parallel to that, helps to really protect the most vulnerable amongst us. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pop off so you don't have to watch me speak. And then at the end, I'll pop back on for Q&A. So once again, thanks for being here. All right. To recap our time today, we're going to talk a little bit about what we learned in Part 1. I'm going to review some prevention methods. I'm going to highlight some of the top 7 protective measures. We'll talk a little bit about reporting and response and why that is so important. We'll talk about what happens if a child discloses abuse and some of the action steps that you need to take. And then we'll wrap up with ongoing support. I'll take any questions, but that's really what our time today is about. So let's go ahead and recap what we learned in Part 1. Some very important things that you'll want to keep in mind as we go through the information today. We did learn that consistency is key. So when you are creating processes or you are rolling things out that prevent predators from integrating into your organization, consistency is key. We also learned during Part 1 that familiarity really does equal false assumptions about people. So we want to put aside those false assumptions of what we think predators look like, how we think they act, and we want to push all of that out of our minds today so that we can learn some new things, so that we can look at our organizations with fresh new eyes. We also talked about the number one reason that child and youth-focused organizations are taken to court are allegations of sexual abuse. And that is why what you'll learn today is so important for protecting that. We also learned that less than 10% of child predators are ever criminally prosecuted. What this means for you is that 90% or more will not have red flags in their history. So it is really important that you set up some boundaries for protection. We also learned that there's really no predator stereotype. They come from all walks of life, educated, uneducated, wealthy, poor, male, female, young, old. There's just no stereotype. So each predator is very unique in how they come across with their characteristics. Also, we talked about some changes to the grooming model and how even 3 to 5 years ago when I was doing this, we really saw predators groom only victims. Now we're seeing things like predators grooming families, boards of directors, those in authority, and they're taking longer so that they get more access to children. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. We also learned that they work in groups of 2 or more. So if you do have one predator in your organization, chances are you probably have another or maybe 2 or 3 more actually working there as well. Last thing, social media and how it has been used to connect predators for friendship, for education, for targeting organizations. So be very wary of predators aren't isolated. They work, they have a tremendous amount of education and information available to them to get better at deception and getting into organizations. So we wanted to talk about that. And then the last thing is we talked about victim identification. And you know, when we covered characteristics of predators, one thing that came up was good listeners, intuitive. I shared an interview that I had done many years ago. I got to sit through and listen to a predator outline how they pick their victims. And what we learned from that conversation was that within less than a minute, in a room full of children, they will pick their victims. And this is based on how the child interacts. Are they out on the periphery? What is their mood? What is their response to authority or teachers, things like that? So there really is a system for choosing victims. So we highlighted that. So those are some of the points that we're going to use to build on what we learned in part one. So let's move. Here is a model of methods and prevention. And I share this model because truly knowledge is power. And if you can understand how predators work, it will help you to be able to look, one, at people with a healthy skepticism, as well as your organization where there are gaps in safety and protection. So let's talk a little bit about this model. We reviewed this in part one, and some of the methods that are commonly used are authority. Those in authority figures will often leverage their position to get access to children. They'll leverage their position to keep children and victims silent. They work tirelessly to build trust, to bring down barriers so that children will trust them. And then, if possible, they use force or threats. And that is really an encapsulation of the majority of the methods that they use for access and control. So access and control are two things that a predator must have in order to get access to victims, or in order to victimize or even silence their victims. And one thing that I wanted to highlight is that when we look at these methods and the things that they must have and the results of that, this is often the case when we see several safety breakdowns. Last time we talked about safety breakdowns such as isolation or lack of screening. Sometimes cultures set lots of secrecy. Anytime there's unrestricted access to children, meaning someone in authority gets truly to have unrestricted access. They can pull children out of classrooms. They can isolate them whenever they want. They can move them from building to building at a whim. That's the unrestricted access. We also talked about a lack of zero accountability. When there is no accountability, that's when predators thrive. We talked about low transparency, a lack of training and education. These are all safety breakdowns that we see occur when these methods are deployed by them. So what do we do? In regards to prevention, we'll talk about policy in a little bit more detail. We'll talk about protective measures, as I highlighted. But if I can share anything with you today, I hope that you will take away two things. It is so important that everything that you work to with policy, with protective measures, they center on two things: decreasing isolation and increasing accountability. And we'll talk more about what that looks like, frontline, action-oriented type things later on in this presentation. But I really want you to remember that: decreasing isolation and increasing accountability. Because when you design your organizational policies around those two things, what you start to see is increased safety and a much lower risk of abuse. And I highlighted in bold down at the bottom of the slide, one key point is that I always like people to remember as well, is that predator behavior is very predictable and always repetitive. So if they find a system that works, they rarely, if ever, deviate from it. So by you sort of understanding the way that these systems work, you'll be able to spot more, and you'll be able to put more just barriers in place for that. So This is the model of method and prevention. Let's go ahead and move on. So prevention methods. Prevention is key, really. And it's so important that we talked a little bit about policy, but let's talk about policy that matters. These are policies and guidelines that really help to eliminate the gray area of interacting with children. Every single worker, and that includes volunteers, staff, leadership, those types of things, should understand the policies and how they truly affect safety and security, and they should live it. Everyone in your organization should live by these policies, and there should be rarely an exception. We also talked about decreasing isolation, increasing accountability. It's a huge prevention method, and one thing that if you just focus on that will help to bring other things to light. I highlight in here a well-written safety plan, and that safety plan includes a child protection policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about the child protection policy a few slides in the future, but that is really important that that overall safety plan does include your child protection policy. The prioritizing of training and education. This is valuable because you don't want to hit people with information just once. Because I don't know if you're like me, but I really retain things better when information is chunked out and given to me in small bits. So what we mean by that is we've had a customer in the past highlight some of their training, which is a 10-minute weekly standing meeting. So at that meeting, every week they would highlight a policy or they would talk about something different. And then they would, of course, do educational training, but those were for bigger, bigger concepts twice a year. But each week that information was chunked out, and that was so important because people retained it. They were able to ask questions about it and really learn it. Next thing is the screening process. And we recently just did a webinar on just the entire screening process. I don't have time to get into that today, but I will highlight for you that what KidCheck identifies as a really comprehensive screening process includes things like a written application that's 100% completed, a background check for those that are working directly with children. And that background check should take place reoccurring every 12 to 24 months, because we'll talk about why a little bit later. The face-to-face interview and how this is such a tool for you to gauge or to gain more knowledge and to gauge a person's commitment and fit to your organization. References. So few references are ever followed up on. Less than, I think actually, we heard it mentioned once, 70–80% of references are just left aside because people don't have time. But these references provide such valuable information, and they give you a picture of this person's history working with children and youth. Social media checks. In today's world, a lot of younger generation, the millennial generation, my generation, everybody lives out loud online. And so doing social media checks and having waivers signed that you will be accessing their social media accounts is really important to be included with things like the written application. Motor vehicle report. If they're going to be transporting or driving children, there needs to be some sort of meat around that. And then a waiting period. For those of you that have joined us today that are houses of worship, this waiting period can be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, and that is a very valuable thing. So that is screening encapsulated, but certainly not all the detail behind it. Next, just encouraging transparency and communication. As a leader in your organization, you cannot be everywhere at once. It's just impossible. And so by prioritizing that open door policy and really encouraging people, even if they see something that's nothing, being able to bring it to you, being able to talk about it, that really does create that transparent culture. And then you, as a leader, being able to answer the really tough questions, not only from your boards and your leadership that's above you, but also from parents. Because I will tell you today, parents have a much different lens of how they are evaluating whether or not to leave their children in certain organizations. They are asking questions about child protection policy. They are seeing how things roll when they check in and check out their kids. I mean, they are watching you and how your organization runs very closely. So that's very important. And then the last thing is, don't be afraid to say no. And I know this is so hard for all of us who don't like confrontation, but learning how to say no, parents appreciate that. They may not like it when you say no, or you have to reiterate a policy or, follow one of your guidelines. But being able to say no is very, very important. And know that your responsibility is to the protection of that child. It's not to the angry parent that's in your face for that brief moment. Because once their anger subsides, they realize that these policies and guidelines are put in place to protect their children. You're not trying to inconvenience them, you're trying to protect their children. So those are the key prevention methods that I wanted to highlight for you today. So let's move on to protective measures. Now, I mentioned briefly about a child protection policy, and that is also a whole nother webinar series that we offer, whether you're updating one or whether you're writing one from scratch. We've got resources for you. So the child protection policy, as I mentioned earlier, is really to eliminate the gray area of interacting with kids. It's also to create a safer environment for workers and children. And then the last thing, it really does increase parent peace of mind. It's just so important. And that child protection policy won't just have safety guidelines included with it. It'll also include other things like your sickness or wellness policy, just different things like that, your check-in and check-out process. So that child protection policy, I put it on there as number one because it's really your foundational piece of what you're going to work from. So next, screening. We talked about screening and the 7 elements of it. I briefly highlighted them. There's just so much more detail behind those. But I also wanted to make mention that it's really important that if you're pulling from, for those houses of worship that are with us or camps that utilize other older children, youth needs to be screened much like adults need to be screened. And I will highlight for you at the very end, I've put in some links to some additional resources on the blog that talk about screening youth and why that is so important and how our ever-changing world requires just as much introspection into their lives as they do adults. So just know that we've got information for you on how to properly screen youth and adults. But I can't belabor that point. Screening is such a key boundary piece for you. Establishing restroom procedures. This came up in part 1, and I wanted to highlight just a couple of things for you with the restroom procedures. One is a worker, staff, leader should never, ever be alone with a child in a bathroom. If I had an exclamation point sign to hold up for you right now, I would do it because that is something that you have to remember. They should never be alone with a child in a bathroom. Now, your bathroom policies and procedures really reflect your facility design. So whether you have a bathroom within the classroom or whether you have bathrooms outside the classroom, those policies will really reflect how it's set up for you. And they're always unique to each organization. But a couple of things that I wanted to highlight, if you've got a bathroom within the classroom, you should really only allow one child in the bathroom at a time. If a child can go on their own, let them. Just stand outside the door, ready to help if it's needed. If a child does need help and they haven't finished up in some time, you can talk through the door or slightly keep it cracked, something like that without looking or having somebody peering in. And then the last thing, if assistance is required in a bathroom that's within a classroom, have another volunteer stand at the door and watch you as you assist that child. So I wasn't able to highlight those part 1, but I wanted to highlight them today. And then, of course, For bathrooms that are outside of the classroom, you know, always before allowing kids into a bathroom, make sure there are no adults or teenagers in there. That is a really key point and something I forgot to mention in part one, but I wanted to mention it today. I also wanted to mention that while kids are in the bathroom and using it, you don't allow adults or teens to enter. The next thing, and this is really for younger kids, don't let the children close the door all the way or lock the door. You know, just let them know they need to keep it slightly ajar. So as you stand outside, you can kind of hear what's going on. And then if a child does need assistance in the bathroom, have another adult or a security team member or someone stand in the doorway and watch exactly what you're doing. So that once again, that increasing accountability, putting two sets of eyes on very vulnerable situations. So I just talk about the bathroom procedures a little bit more because it did come up. Also, transportation processes, you know, that's really important for offsite events, and that really does, there needs to be something concrete around that, because oftentimes you do have workers alone with children in a bus or a car or something, and so those transportation processes need to be really defined. On-site or off-site event guidelines, I think we've all heard the stories of different organizations that have lock-ins or shut-ins or things like that. Those off-site event guidelines are really important. And then your check-in and check-out process. Of course, I work for KidCheck, so I'm going to be partial to this process. But the reason is because you really need to have that information surrounding those kids on who is able to pick them up, who is not authorized to pick them up. Is there anything going on? Is there health information or custody situations or things like that? Your check-in and check-out process is once again one of the core competencies of your overall safety plan, and it really, really does need to be defined and work very smoothly in terms of parents checking in and checking out. We don't want it to be cumbersome. We don't want it to slow families down. We want it to empower them to check in their children with confidence. So that is that one. And then, you know, define your classroom expectations. You know, the rule of twos is really a tried and true rule, making sure that you always have two adults, two sets of eyes, but I always have to highlight this point. They cannot be related. They cannot be married. They have to be two separate, fully screened adults that are non-related. And that rule of twos, I've not only seen it work in nursery and elementary situations. I'm now watching it being done on the youth side as well, especially with counseling and things like that. That rule of two is really, really important to deploy throughout your organization. Classroom ratios, once again, that's a big topic. I don't have time to share all the ratios with you, but I do have a link at the very end that will give you some more content on what those ratios look like. And you know, KidCheck always recommends that your ratios meet the National Association of Education of Young Children standards. And that's a really good and helpful guideline, and we'll provide that information for you at the end. Visibility guidelines. We talked briefly about that. It's just really important that classrooms aren't shoved in the back of buildings. The more visibility that people have to what's going on in the classroom, the better. And then, you know, really on the expectation side, how you're going to discipline kids. You know, this is unique to every organization, but one of the things keeping in mind again is that you are reducing isolation and increasing accountability. So for discipline, a child should never be isolated. They should never be moved outside of their group. And you can apply those guidelines and expectations that you have in terms of how you deal with that. But also physical touch. And physical touch should be defined as appropriate and inappropriate. It should be defined for children with workers, workers with youth, youth with children. You should just be talking about what is appropriate to your organization and what is inappropriate. And once you have those expectations set, once again, this really helps just eliminate that gray area and makes everybody a little bit more comfortable. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about reporting and response. And this is always a really, really delicate subject, because when you take action, it's uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. You wish you didn't have to do it, but taking action is so important. There are so many benefits to taking action. And if nothing comes of it, you have established two things. You have told your staff, your workers, your volunteers, your leadership, that no matter what is mentioned, you're going to act on that to protect children. The second thing is that you're going to show parents that regardless of the situation, once again, your responsibility is to the safety of that child, and you're going to act on that. That is your responsibility. Your prioritization is the protection and safety within your organization. So taking action, while uncomfortable and difficult, is oftentimes so important. I had a church reach out to us recently, and in Sunday school, a boy disclosed abuse from a stepfather regarding his sister, who is elementary age. And the children's ministry director was having such a hard time with what to do with that disclosure. And we often see this. And in order to make it easier, they usually bring it back within the walls of the church. And it's always difficult and uncomfortable when I have to remind those in leadership over child and youth focused organizations, especially houses of worship, that when we're talking about the abuse of a young child, we are not talking about sin. We are talking about a crime. And a crime means that you need to report it to the authorities. This is not something you can sweep under a rug. This is not something you can just put out of your mind. This is a crime. And in most states now, we're starting to see those in leadership over children are becoming mandatory reporters across the board. So your responsibility is to that child, and that mandatory reporting needs to happen once a child discloses within 24 hours in most states. So for houses of worship that are on the call today, I cannot highlight to you enough, when disclosure happens, you need to look at it as a crime being committed versus the sin of another. So in addition to that, we also see a plethora of benefits to the victims, because oftentimes what we hear is that children will disclose abuse up to 40 times before an adult will finally go, what's going on in that situation? Or what is that child really saying? 40 times the average child discloses. And it's not just by words, it's by pictures, it's by body language, it's by interaction with other children. Children speak volumes without words. So you really need to make sure that, you're listening, because there are so many benefits. Not to be dramatic, but oftentimes you can certainly save a life, because we have really no idea sometimes what goes on behind closed doors of people. And so you could very easily save a life. The last point I want to talk about with reporting is we talked about this a little bit, I think, in part one. Offenders and predators, they rely on silence. That is one, if they can create secrecy and silence and nobody's talking about anything, that's where they thrive. So don't give them that leg up. They rely on silence. So let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk a little bit more about what to report, when, and how. And anytime that you witness abuse, anytime that, as the example I gave to you, a child discloses, if there is constant or consistent signs and indications, compact bruising, just things like that, that really needs to be highlighted or reported. And oftentimes you may have a situation where an offender will disclose. We often see this in houses of worships where, for whatever reason, it gets to be too much and an offender will disclose what they've been doing. And so those are things that really need to be reported. Now, I understand that sometimes, webinars like this are great, but I can't always be there on the front line to help you. So what I've done is provide you the National Child Abuse Hotline down at the bottom. And from what I understand, I've not called them myself, but for those who've been in past workshops who have, they are a great amount of information and support for organizations, especially organizations who are dealing with multiple predators at different levels of leadership. So take that down, make sure that you keep that somewhere, so if you ever get in a situation where you need help and you need them sort of tell you what next steps, and you can utilize that resource. So once again, what to report is when you've witnessed abuse, when a child discloses, when there's signs or indications, and also when an offender discloses. Those are the main things that you'll want to report. So let's go on. So oftentimes I get the question, I have a child that has disclosed, what do I do? How do I respond to this? And I put all of these bullet points up here, and most of these are common sense, especially when you've been working with children for multiple years and your career has been centered around working with children. But I think it's always important to highlight it, because at the moment that it happens, oftentimes it's really hard to remember what to do. So I always, of course, you highlight common sense, stay calm, show love and respect, offer praise for their courage, because most of the time they're frightened or they're upset because somebody that they love, they're going to get in trouble. And so, just reassuring them that they're not to blame, being able to let them speak freely. This is really important for two reasons. One is, children, when they disclose, tend to be, one, a little gun shy. And two, if you let them speak freely and don't interrupt, you will need that information for pulling together your report. So that detail is very, very important that you listen carefully to, because they will share a lot that will need to be turned over to police, and it will help police have a much more clear case. So making sure that you let them speak. Using open-ended questions like, can you tell me more? Or, just things that continue to help them with their story. You don't want to lead them, but you want to give them the opportunity to keep talking. Don't offer false promises. This is really hard. We've heard this from a lot of survivors, that when people found out, they said, oh, this will never happen to you again. And in fact, those children were taken back out of the system and put back in with their families where it happened again. And so don't make those false promises. When a child discloses abuse, you need to protect the child immediately from the suspected offender, because you have no idea what will happen if that offender learns that they've disclosed and you hand them back over. That is a recipe for disaster. And that is where I talk about you have the opportunity to save a life. Reporting to authorities. I've already belabored that point, that these types of things are considered a crime, and you really need to bring in your police as well as your supervisors of your organization, whatever that might look like. But then documenting the disclosure. And this is once again where I highlight, don't interrupt, let them speak freely, and let them be able to share what they want to, because that will all go in your document of disclosure for authorities. So very important. And then also, protecting the child's right to privacy. Making sure that people aren't getting details and talking about it within your organization. That child deserves privacy, especially if authorities get involved. And so just making sure that happens is really, really important. Okay, let's go on to the next one, which is what you say. So options for disclosure. We have heard this time and time and time again. The most valuable thing you can say to a child that discloses to you is, I believe you. Because the several other times that they've disclosed, they might have been told, oh, you're mistaken. Oh, you're just being silly. Oh, you're wrong about that person. Or Uncle so-and-so would never do that. Or Aunt so-and-so. So looking that child in the eye and telling them, I believe you, is a very powerful thing for ongoing healing. Also thanking them for trusting you with the information is very important. Reiterating that they did the right thing, asking for help, making sure that they know how sorry you are that this happened to them, but that you're there to help in any way that you can. Just encouraging them to take as much time as they need, say what they need to say. I will never forget the recent case. I can't remember. I think it was a church out of Missouri where a boy had been systematically abused within his youth group for, it was like 6 years since he was a boy. And he said in his own words, I showed up at court on the day to finally face my abuser. And he said, I was filled with joy when I walked into that courtroom and saw all the people sitting there. And he said, I sat down and I had a new wave of strength. And I had, with all of these people there, he said, and then as the trial began, he suddenly realized that all of those people were there to support his abuser. He had less than a handful of people sitting behind him supporting him, but all of these other people showed up to support the accused. And for a survivor or a victim of abuse, that is a devastating blow. And so making sure that they understand that you're there and that you stand with them. And, and just always reiterating that, things may never be the same, but more than likely they will improve. They will be better. So here are some words that you can take if disclosure happens and a little bit of background on some of the options. So moving on, ongoing support. I highlighted a stat in part 1 that talked about for those who are with us in houses and worships and for those camps and fitness facilities and, child programs and stuff. What we see is that, the aftermath of abuse is with adults. We see a high percentage of men and women. I think I shared 2/3, and I can't remember if that came out of a Barna research or Church Law and Tax, but it was essentially to say that there are a lot of adults that have experienced violent sexual assault before the age of 18. They're now having children and they're evaluating organizations in which to leave their children with. And so, part of what they look for are these protective measures to be implemented. If you do have an organization that you have parents who are survivors of abuse, this ongoing support is so important. And I do realize, and I've been told by some organizations that, the supporting the children and family thing, that's just not for us. We just, we'll refer them out to other resources. But for our organization, that's just not our strength. That's just not, and rightfully so. For those of you that do take this on, implementing the protective measures, offering support to the child as well as the family. We've already talked about that. Just showing up and listening and, affirming and helping them to understand that their story is going to make a difference. As a leader in your organization, posting signs about prevention and reporting, what your guidelines are, having that front and center speaks so much to those who are survivors, because it shows that you acknowledge it happens and that you're doing something about it. You may even want to go so far, if you have quite a few parents who are dealing with different situations, host a support group. But more than that, always talking about your policy and your zero tolerance for abuse. continuing to communicate your commitment to child protection and speak often about protection. It's something that those over children and youth should really be focused on. You should be constantly talking about it and being able to answer those questions about why you're doing what you're doing. Because sometimes processes offend people. They slow things down for a while. And you want to be able to speak to that and why you're taking, the steps that you are. So let's go ahead and move on. Here are some safety resources that I wanted to highlight as we move forward. You've got the KidCheck website, our blog. I've got the links for you at the very last slide. We've got all kinds of safety resources for you available, downloads and other training tools and stuff. So make sure you take a look at those things. You can also join our social community, which we've got always people out there asking really valuable questions and really being able to share their experiences so that you can learn from each other. I highlight Plan to Protect because if in fact you need to update or you need to start from scratch a child protection policy, or you need to really put together some targeted training, Plan to Protect is a wonderful training organization that has everything you need to roll out your policies and come alongside you to help create those. So I really highly encourage you to check out their website. They've always got great stuff. They're also on social and are always sharing good tips. Just a really, really important training organization. And then here's my contact information. If you've got questions that you're not comfortable asking after today and you'd like to speak with me directly, please feel free to reach out. I'm always here as a resource for you, and I'm always happy to share the latest and greatest information that we have, as well as, we've been doing this a long time, and we're always happy to share the knowledge that we have. And then last but not least, you'll see these hyperlinked. These are topical things that we've talked about today. These links will provide you great detail in terms of what you need to know. So we've got the CPP screening, youth screening, the check-in and check-out process. You don't have to use KidChecks, but if you've got something and you want to make it better, certainly look at that. Rule of 2, classroom ratios, these are all just really important things. So that concludes my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and put the resource page back up here. And I think we're right on time. Woo, that never happens with me. So I'm sorry if I spoke a little fast today, but I just wanted to make sure that I was respectful of your time and that we got through it. So Alyssa, are there any questions?
Yes, there are. So thank you, first of all, for all that great information. As you expect, a lot of interest. A lot of people have different questions on things. I'm going to go back towards the beginning where we were talking about church protection policy. So as you just mentioned, Angela, there is a link in the deck that will give them more information on a CPP. In addition to that, the question had come up, is there a publication that gives an example of a policy for a church? A couple of people were interested in that. Do you have anything in addition to that link they'll receive on the CPP that might help them with an example of one?
I do believe actually I've got some examples and I'm happy to share those. I haven't accessed them in a long time, so it might take me a little bit to find them. But yes, I do believe I have some external examples, as well as if you just Google child protection policy or go out to Plan to Protect, they also have sample examples out there as well. So there's a whole bunch of information, and a lot of it depends on the type of organization that you're in, whether you're a drop-in daycare or a fitness facility or a house of worship. There's going to be different child protection policies that fit you a little bit better in terms of what you need to share and communicate as your foundational piece.
Okay, so great. For anyone who's interested in getting a sample, would you just email Angela? Angela, would you put the slide back up with your email address on it, please?
Absolutely.
And anyone who's looking for examples, please email Angela and let her know, and she'll get something out to you.
Absolutely.
Okay, continuing on with the screening area. In California, the DOJ has a box on the background check that reports any further arrests that take place after the application is cleared. Is that okay?
Yes, but remember that oftentimes with background checks, they don't include any criminal cases or federal information of crimes on a background check. So it's important to understand in your state what your background check does not include, because that's a lot of times where people get tripped up, is they think a background check is all encompassing for every state in the US, but in all actuality, oftentimes we don't see federal crimes, DUIs, or some other types of activity highlighted in those checks. So it's really important that if you're going to be using something from the Department of Motor Vehicles, that you ask them, what does this not include? Because that's really where you're going to find if that's going to meet your needs or not.
Okay, we have a couple questions in regards to the rule of two, so I'm going to group those together and ask you them individually. So the first one's from Christy, and she makes a great point here. Okay, so no relatives are allowed to work together. She's also heard that two men are not allowed to work together. Their church policy is no married man can work with another married woman that they're not married to, so it leaves her with no men to work with. Any suggestions?
Wow. Once again, that rule of two, the whole premise of it is to really increase accountability. And I think oftentimes we've seen cases where when a married couple, or even just two related people, where abuse has occurred, the other one will never report that abuse. And so keeping people as far away that are related from those vulnerable situations. In regards to men, it really is organizational specific. I've seen policies amended as of late in terms of a man working with you should always have a man and woman working together, non-related, of course. And those were policies that were amended based on parent feedback that said, you're strapped on volunteers because we have no way to work around this. So it is a challenge, and it is something that you just really need to talk about with your leadership in terms of, and if you are allowing men, what are those parameters look like? And, the vetting process, making sure that they're all 100% screened, background check completed. We have seen in some organizations where organizations will spend a little bit more money and do a federal check on those men who are not married or not related to anyone but working with children. And that requires fingerprints and FBI and those types of things. But we have seen that. And I think largely it's because predominantly, predator position is held by 80% or over men. We see women climbing to that equal, but that's usually what I've seen some organizations. And I'm sorry, because that can be tough for all those guidelines to be there. Alyssa, does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So continuing down that path, Wendy had a question as well around the rule of twos. So she has two adjoining rooms, so the kids can run back and forth.
Okay.
Can there be one worker in each room as long as they can see each other? Or would you suggest not opening the second room unless you have two workers in each room?
I would suggest the latter. And the reason being is because it's impossible to stay within eyesight if that door is open of each other. And we often, 25% of molestation that happens in the classroom happens in front of other people. And you've got your 2 or 3 fully screened adults, and you have one person that has been molesting children in the presence of everyone else. So I would highly recommend the latter, where you keep that door closed, you have your rule of twos associated with each room, 2 fully screened, non-related adults in those rooms. And that really is to protect your organization as well as the children.
Same general concept thought here from Deborah. So first of all, regarding the rule of twos, thank you for all the information you've been sharing. You recommend not having married couples serve together, as you've reiterated here. Her church has volunteers who want to serve as a couple, and we're not able to add another person to serve with them because it depletes the volunteer pool too quickly. So based on that, what are your thoughts about installing cameras in the children's classroom as an added measure of oversight?
I think cameras are fantastic. And, as of within the last 6 months, we've seen some national cases where a predator has been actually convicted based on video footage. And most of the time, these predators were in leadership. They have, we've seen cases where up to 40 victims. So I am a huge proponent of, video in the classroom, but it's too easy to get around. You still have to stick with those policies of non-married couples serving together. I mean, and oftentimes it's hard within my own house of worship. I mean, my own church struggles with this because you do have a lot of married couples who want to serve, especially in children's areas, but being able to separate them. And I think adding the cameras just gives you another layer of protection, but really following that rule of two where you don't have related people volunteering in one classroom is really important, to just separate them out or just ask them, we can't put you two together, but are there areas that you would, can one take third grade and one take fifth grade, or one take kindergarten and one take, where you're reducing that risk is really important.
So when you think about related people, Angela, what about if it's a parent volunteer related to a youth volunteer working at the same time?
Same thing. Same thing applies. And the reason is because family members they rarely ever report abuse if they see it. And there are some states where family members, not only just married couples, but they're not required to testify against each other. So, I hate to swing the pendulum all the way over, but these are really our policies that protect organizations, reduce risk, and increase that safety for children. So non-related is really what I would reiterate once again.
Okay, makes sense. Switching gears to more very just separate specific questions back again. Eric had a question. Is there a medication policy for handing it out to kids, whether at a lock-in or an overnight trip?
Yes, and that's a fantastic question. And yes, I've seen a medication policy one time before. It's becoming more common, but I'll look through my records. If you need one, I'll see what I can find, because I have seen them, and it's really, really important, because, and just not only for the child receiving medication, but also for the worker to sort of have those expectations lined out. So yes, medication policies and guidelines are very important, especially for overnight offsite trips. And Eric, if you need one, I will definitely see if I will track one down for you.
Okay. Maria has a specific question on cell phone policy. So they had a leader that let a kid get on his cell phone, and they started posting tons of pictures of social media. So what are your thoughts on a cell phone policy?
Well, I don't think that leaders should be providing their cell phone to those that they are over. I feel like, one, if you are taking pictures of other people's children and then posting them, one, you're not allowed to do that. As an organization, nobody should be posting on social media except for those leaders who have been given that role and responsibility. And I can tell you firsthand experience that is a very dangerous thing, because sometimes if you're taking pictures of kids who are in protective custody or have, custodial issues going on or different things like that, you can really put them in danger. So social media from an organization should only be posted by leaders, not by children.
Okay. Changing topics again. This is from Daisy. How do leaders handle early elementary children who are involved in touching each other inappropriately?
That's a great question. And that actually, didn't that come up in part one? I thought we had, so once again, going back to your child protection policy and establishing your classroom expectations for what appropriate and inappropriate touch is. And I think when I highlighted that expectation or guideline needs to be set for children with adults, adults with youth, and children with children. So it's very important that if you face this situation, that you have both guardians or parents pulled aside and say, hey, I just wanted to reiterate to you what our appropriate touching policy looks like. And we've seen kids touching in inappropriate ways, and we just want to highlight this for you and make sure that your kids understand what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in the classroom or within the organization. But really reviewing that policy with your parents and making sure that they understand what that is and they can explain it to their children, and you can reiterate it or back that policy up within your setting. That's usually where we see that behavior end, is when parents get involved and then you're able to support and reiterate that policy on site between those kids, because they've already heard it from their parents, what's inappropriate touching. And then as a leader, you may say, once again, your parents have told you this is not allowed, this is inappropriate touching, and just reiterating that.
Okay, I have a couple questions more related to check-in, check-out. Daisy asks or says, we don't have parents check out. Should we?
Absolutely. Checkout is actually extremely important, and having security features around that checkout is very important, because that's really where we see sometimes the custodial issues get a little bit in the gray area. We had one woman years ago explain that she was in a classroom. The little girl, oh, daddy, ran up, hugged, and he was like, hey, I'm just going to grab her. And she was like, okay. And he took off with her. Well, the mom showed up. They found out there was a restraining order. He was not to have any custodial contact. And they lost that child for 72 hours before they were able to track her down. And the woman shared, had she had a checkout process, had she known, whether it's on her phone or on the child's tag or something to reiterate that they had a non-authorized guardian for this child, I mean, she was devastated. And the stakes were very high with this particular situation. And so being able to check out and make sure that no one that shouldn't have access to that child is getting access, because kids are going to see parents. They're going to see people. They may not know the custodial issues or the restraining orders or the no contact orders, but they're just going to see their parent. So it's so important to having that information available for you as a leader and also for your teachers in the classroom. We've got several different security features with KidCheck that I just absolutely love, because they really reiterate that not giving that child to an unauthorized guardian.
So on that same note, Angela, from checkout, but changing gears a little bit about talking about age policy for checkout, Kevin says that in their church, they have a very specific rule where only a sibling, high school or older, is able to check out a sibling, and they must present the claim tag. Does that sound like a reasonable minimum age policy for child checkout?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. If the child in that age minimum has been given the slip or the tag or the guardian receipt or whatever it might be, I would say that's absolutely age appropriate and fine, as long as they have the proper identification codes or something to check out that child. Very important.
Okay, so we're running low on time. We have two more questions that are related to Rule of Two, so I'm going to pop those over to you, and then we'll see where we're at on the hour. So the first one's from Christopher. And the topic of Rule of Two in youth workers. If youth are appropriately screened, could an older screened youth, unrelated to the adult, sufficiently satisfy the Rule of Two? When you talk about adults, you're only talking 18 plus?
Yes, that is actually our assumptions. And I didn't have time to outline what the assumptions were around what defines youth. But what we say here at KidCheck is a minor should never be put in charge of other minors. And minors should also never be by themselves over children. They should always have a fully screened, fully vetted adult overseeing their activities. And the reason that we say that is because oftentimes if you get minors but still 18 plus, 19, 20, that shift of power with some of the younger kids is just too much to not have an adult there overseeing the activity. Anytime a minor, 21 or younger, is volunteering, they should have a fully screened, approved, and vetted adult by their side overseeing the activity.
And there is one of the links in that slide that you have, the last one that everyone will get, that has stuff to use screening. So folks, take a look at that too. Getting close to the end here, so let me ask Angela's, which is around the rule of twos as well, which is for the bathroom policy. So for the bathroom policy needing 2 people, and 2 people need to stay in the classroom, would that not require 4 people, or should you have 2 dedicated bathroom people for all classrooms?
So we've seen different scenarios with this one. That's a great question, Angela. We've seen, I don't know what your structure is, but in these types of scenarios, we've seen some organizations leverage their security team. So if in fact you have a situation where classroom accountability will be limited, really leveraging the security team to be a second or third pair of eyes. But also we've seen 2 things occur. One, reminding parents to take their kids to the bathroom before they step in to the classroom. And 2, if there is a shortage of people, taking all the kids together and pulling out, letting those who have to go in, but keeping them all together at the same time. So where you're utilizing your 2 adults, but you're not leaving kids in the classroom minus the accountability. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And on that note, everybody as well, as Angela said, if you have additional questions, whether you need clarification on these or something different, her email's right there, her phone's right there. We're more than happy to help with that. So we've hit the hour, but we had one more question come in, so I'm going to hit you up with that one, Angela, and it's from Sherry. It says, do you have to check the children out if they have a security slip? So I think, Sherry, if this is not what you mean, but I think you're saying if they have a tag, do you still have to check them out?
I would say that question's a little unclear to me, but I would always say yes. You should always apply your checkout process to any child, even if they have a security tag.
Agreed, and I think that's where you check the codes to make sure that they're properly checked out to the right person, or you're using what's in KidCheck and Admin Console to make sure that person's authorized.
Absolutely.
Okay, I know I just said this last one, but we just got one more sneak in from Christopher. And then we'll let everybody go. So thank you all for your time on this. So Christopher, just to follow up, if a 21 plus screened adult is in charge of the ministry context, then a screened unrelated youth does or does not satisfy rule of 2. Do you want me to reread that one?
Yes, please.
So if a 21 plus screened adult is in charge of the ministry, then a screened unrelated youth, does that or does that not satisfy the rule of 2?
That does satisfy the rule of 2 because you have one adult, 21 years of age or older, fully screened, monitoring a minor. Because that 21, we're really concerned with minors being in charge of minors. And that's really what we're trying to eliminate. So if you have a 21-year-old that's fully screened and a minor that's fully screened, yes, that absolutely does meet the rule of 2 requirements.
Okay. Everyone, thank you so much. Angela, I'll pass it back to you for the thanks, but we appreciate your being here.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for those who sat through both part 1 and part 2. Once again, this is just a really important topic, and I'm always here if you need anything else, if more information, and please just email me and I'll see what I can do. And if I don't have it, I'll try to seek it out for you. So thanks again. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Take care.